Hello, I'm Bill Cork, and I'm an Assistant Director of Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries for the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventists. In this talk, I want to speak about chaplains as peace builders. This is a reflection I gave to a group of military chaplains in the summer of 2019 after I attended the Summer Institute for Faculty in Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute at the University of Notre Dame. I start with three quotes. This first from the Sermon on the Mount is our calling as Christians and as chaplains. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." Second, keeping in mind the military context in which I originally gave this, a comment that General Douglas MacArthur made in his 1962 farewell address at West Point. "The soldier above all other people prays for peace, for he must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war." We've been at war for 20 years as a nation, and some of our chaplains have deployed 4, 5, 6 times to Iraq and Afghanistan. We know what war looks like. Third, a quote you might not be familiar with. It's from a book sitting in most military chapels, the Book of Worship for U.S. Forces, which was the last Department of Defense sponsored hymnal published in 1974. This quote has stayed with me. "In every prayer for peace, there is a touch of blasphemy. It's as though war were inevitable and only God could extricate us. But we are the warriors, the makers and wagers of destruction, not God, not even they. Perhaps our prayers for peace should be for forgiveness, and perhaps they should be said first to our brothers." Last summer, I attended the Summer Institute for Faculty in Peace Studies at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. For some time, I've been reflecting on how we teach non-combatancy at Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries. Seventh-day Adventists haven't done so with much intentionality since the end of the draft in 1973. In April of 2019, at a special General Conference symposium on the subject, Mario Ceballos, Director of Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries for the World Church, said, "Adventists are people of peace." And that's an important point. Our position on non-combatancy, that we will not bear weapons in time of war, has to be seen within the context of a broader commitment to peace, reflective of a desire to live out the teachings of Jesus expressed in the Sermon on the Mount. So over the last couple of years, I've been studying this, and I gave a presentation at Andrews University last spring on teaching peace during multi-generation war. How do we work with our youth and young adults to take advantage of their desires, their passion for making a difference, and use it to be more intentional about creating and articulating this ethic of peace. You can find that on video. I recorded that presentation recently as well. And in the description on YouTube, you'll find the text of that talk with its footnotes. It'll be published in a forthcoming volume by Advent Source. You'll also find a significant bibliography that I've been developing. It was while building that bibliography and looking for curriculum on peace that I remembered the Kroc Institute program. A friend of mine taught there for a number of years. And I remembered their program for educators. And so I wrote to the director, George Lopez, and asked if he could share any of the curriculum or the bibliography. And he said, "Hey, why don't you come and be part of the summer program?" And so I did. This was our group. Mainly college and university professors from around the world, from places like Nepal, the Philippines, Colombia, throughout the US and more. There were several Army veterans and a few high school teachers, all looking for ways to teach peace. The Kroc approach is multifaceted and strategic, as represented by the Kroc Wheel that you see here. Let's take a look. We start in the center and we see three main focal points: structural and institutional change, justice and healing, and violence prevention, conflict response, and transformation. Then in the outer circle, we see the tasks that are related to each. And you see the lines kind of blur. These are not hard and fast borders. But for justice and healing, we have things like restorative justice, transitional justice. How do we go into an area that's had war and bring about healing and reconciliation? How do we heal from trauma? Oh, that's a critical thing for us as military chaplains as we deal with service members suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder and what we're calling moral injury. These are the things that trauma does for us, and being part of things that we feel ashamed of. Seeing immoral things happening, these do damage to the soul. In terms of violence prevention, conflict response, and transformation, we see humanitarian action, government and multilateral efforts, nonviolent social change. We've been seeing a lot of that this summer of 2020. Dialogue, conflict resolution strategies, and education. And that bleeds over into the area of structural and institutional change. From education, we have also development, dealing with transnational and global threats, and law. How do we advocate for victims of injustice? How do we create solidarity both in the U.S. Between members of different races, different socioeconomic groups, and solidarity with the world community? What a critical thing that is right now in this pandemic that we're undergoing. And the U.S. Administration is looking at cutting off ties to the World Health Organization, one of the critical agencies for international cooperation, and looking and building solidarity, realizing that we're in this together and that we all need to be working together for a solution. Now take a look at these and you can see who's responsible for these. Well, lots of different folks. Some involve different educational institutions, legislators, national governments, non-governmental organizations, global agencies like the United Nations or the World Health Organization, individuals, but also there's a role for faith-based organizations in so many of these. Since I gave this presentation to military chaplains, I looked at some military doctrine. What does it say about the role of military was the U.S. government's understanding of the role of the military in keeping and building peace? This is from Joint Publication 3-07.3, which applies to all the military forces. Peace operations. Listen to these definitions. First, peacemaking is a diplomatic process aimed at establishing a ceasefire or an otherwise peaceful settlement of a conflict. Peace building, on the other hand, provides the reconstruction and societal rehabilitation necessary to resolve core conflict issues or prevent further outbreaks of violent conflict. It promotes reconciliation, strengthens and builds civil infrastructure and institutions, builds confidence, and supports economic reconstruction. Now, I was happy on my deployment in 2013 to be part of international partnership missions with nations of the Gulf Cooperative Council. We did partnership missions with many of the nations in the area, and I did what we call religious leader liaison with religious affairs officers of the Kuwait Ministry of Defense, looking at ways to understand each other better. How do we understand better the religious issues in the Middle East? How do they better understand us? So there are positive things doing. Some politicians recently said, oh, the Army's there to kill people and break things. No, it has a much broader role. We've forgotten some of it. A book was recently written about how we failed after World War II in the area of civil affairs. During World War II, as the U.S. government went forward, as the military went forward, it left behind civil affairs experts who could help reconstruct civilian governments and that we dropped a whole lot of knowledge. So, by Vietnam, we forgot how to do that. We talk about winning hearts and minds, but we haven't done a very good job of that over 20 years in the Middle East. But yet, military doctrine says that is part of what we need to do to bring stability and help bring about reconciliation. And in this, chaplains have a role to play. Here I turn to an Army technical publication on religious support and external advisement, the role that chaplains have advising the commander on issues in the area of reformations. Religious area analysis, that involves looking at the different religious issues, perspectives of worldview, who are the different parties at play, and using our perspective as religious leaders to help the commander understand what's going on in the community. Today's Army doctrine really developed during the Bosnian campaign, but it goes back further. A Seventh-day Adventist chaplain, Bob Mole, did this kind of work in Vietnam, helping to understand the different worldviews and perspectives and beliefs of the different Montagnard and other ethnic groups that the U.S. Army was working with in Vietnam. Religious impact assessment is what the chaplain prepares as a staff officer. How does religion affect what we're doing? What impact will our operations have on religious attitudes? We can see how this plays out in the Middle East, where there's this tension between Shia and Sunni, between Yazidis, Druze, Chaldean Catholics, and all these other different religious groups that are in the Middle East. And soldier and leader engagements. We used to use the specific term religious leader liaison, but this is our role in working with, talking specifically about religious issues with civilian leaders who are either religious leaders or they can be political leaders, but looking specifically at the role that religion plays. And this is a capacity that chaplains have when directed by the commander. We don't go out on our own and start making these contacts, but within the context of the commander's mission and this line of effort, as we call it, for building peace, maintaining stability, stability operations is the term. The commander can task us for having these discussions, and that's one of the things I was able to do with religious leaders of the Kuwait Ministry of Defense. Chaplains operating at the strategic level can be important partners for their diplomatic colleagues. They promote the voices of the religious minorities and advocate for human rights. They can engage with intergovernmental and non-governmental agencies and foster reconciliation efforts among divided groups. That gives us a critical role. And strategic level, we're talking about chaplains at the level of Army Central Command in the Middle East. I was part of those efforts and what I was doing as chaplain for a major subordinate command. But here's where we have an influence that goes beyond just what we do, saying prayers and leading religious services for our soldiers. Chaplains also have the responsibility to advise the commander on matters of religion, morals, ethics, and morale as it applies to the members of the unit itself. Chaplains have sometimes failed in this. When I did the Army Chaplain Basic course in the summer of 1986, many of my instructors were Vietnam veterans, and we were still unpacking the lessons of Vietnam. A question that was asked of us was, where were the chaplains at My Lai, where so many civilians were slaughtered under the leadership of Lieutenant Calley? Well, the chaplains failed. A couple heard of the stories of the massacre, but didn't pass the information on. Didn't use their influence and their position to advocate for those who were reporting and to push for an investigation. They weren't there to speak of the damage it was doing to the individuals who participated. So in my fundamental training as an Army chaplain, we were told that we have this critical role of speaking up for morality and justice, that it is crucial. In my last Army Reserve assignment, I was assigned to the Strategic Initiatives Group of the Office of the Army Chief of Chaplains, and my boss was our senior Seventh-day Adventist chaplain in the Army, Jonathan McGraw. While we were working on a project to develop a new resiliency program, some of our fellow chaplains wanted to make it a Bible study. And while we were leaving at the end of the day, Jonathan said to me, "Do you see the difference that our Adventist approach makes? We come at it from a holistic perspective. That's what we bring to our so-called health message. We can bring insights from science, psychology, family theory, and not just have it a Bible study." It was on this basis that one of our former Adventist Chaplaincy Ministries directors, Dick Stenbakken, when he was Family Life Director for the Office of the Chief of Chaplains, created the Army's Family Life Chaplain Program, selecting Army chaplains to get a master's in marriage and family therapy and assigning them at the division and garrison levels. And Jonathan, when he was a brigade chaplain in Hawaii, created the marriage enrichment program that the Army adopted and named Strong Bonds. So when we were developing programs on resilience, we built relationships with researchers in academia and with some of our own Adventist programs, like the Creation Health program produced by Advent Health. Take a look at the facets in this illustration that add up to this acronym of creation. Choice, what are our choices that we make? Rest, are we getting enough rest? Environment, what are all the wider factors that contribute to our health? Activity, are we getting enough exercise? Trust, do we have that confidence in God as well as in other people? Interpersonal relationships, our outlook, is it positive or negative? And nutrition, are we eating healthy? This comprehensive holistic approach is rooted in our theological anthropology, as we say as theologians. See, we don't see the human being as an immortal soul trapped in a physical body with the goal of getting that soul into heaven. Rather, we see humanity as formed from the dust of the earth into which God breathed, and Genesis says the man became a living soul. Jesus didn't say, "I came to take you to heaven," though he did say, "I go to prepare a place for you." But he said he came that we might have life and have it more abundantly. And so he healed, he restored sight, he showed his concern for the daily lives of the people among whom he walked and he lived, and he told us to do the same thing. We Adventists have been known for our emphasis on prophecy. We love to preach on Matthew 24, where Jesus gives the signs of the end, but he says at the end, you don't know the day or the hour. And in fact, don't obsess about this. This isn't the most important thing for you to know. And he goes on then to give a series of parables about what we should be doing while we're waiting. Investing in the world, caring for the hungry, the thirsty, the foreigner, those in prison, the sick. That's why early Adventists, even though they looked for the soon coming of Jesus, were concerned about justice in our world, were ardent abolitionists and preached civil disobedience to immoral human statutes like the Fugitive Slave Law of 1850. It's why we developed a hospital system. Now, in the 1890s, as soon as evidence-based medicine started to be taught at places like Johns Hopkins and the University of Michigan, Ellen White started advocating for sending our physicians there to learn and then to use that learning to enhance what we were doing at our institutions and then to create our own medical school at Loma Linda. Because we are concerned about the well-being of people now. We have, as we say in public health, an ecological approach to the human person. This is why we have Adventist Community Services for Disaster Response and ADRA, the Adventist Development and Relief Agency for International Development. My daughter participated in one of their projects in Madagascar, looking at food safety and how do we keep diseases being spread from animals to humans. A critical issue today given what we know about the novel coronavirus. We are called as Seventh-day Adventists to be people of peace. In 2002, the General Conference issued a statement entitled A Call for Peace. This was on the eve of the Iraq War. This lays out, or the war of Afghanistan, rather, and then Iraq the following year. This lays out what we do and what we need to be doing more of. The Seventh-day Adventist Church operates what may be the second largest worldwide parochial school system. Each of its more than 6,000 schools, colleges, and universities is being asked to set aside 1 week each school year to emphasize and highlight through various programs respect, cultural awareness, nonviolence, peacemaking, conflict resolution, and reconciliation as a way of making a specifically Adventist contribution to a culture of social harmony and peace. With this in mind, the church's education department is preparing curricula and other materials to help in implementing this peace program. The education of the church member in the pew for nonviolence, peace, and reconciliation needs to be an ongoing process. Pastors are being asked to use their pulpits to proclaim the gospel of peace, forgiveness, and reconciliation, which dissolves barriers created by race, ethnicity, nationality, gender, and religion, and promotes peaceful human relations between individuals, groups, and nations. That's what we were called to do in 2002, and we dropped the ball. But it's still there. It's a call, Pastor, for you and your preaching as you talk about Black Lives Matter, as you talk about the social unrest today, as you talk about our responsibility to improve justice and public health. Are you preaching on these things? Schools, are you preparing your students and teaching them and building this culture of peace in the church? Here's a statement that was made 15 years earlier. The president of the General Conference at the time, Neil Wilson, was invited to a conference in Moscow in 1987, attended by Mikhail Gorbachev and other leaders of the then Soviet Union, to look at what it might be, what the world might look like after the Cold War. And this is what he said. Our Christian commitment compels us to reappraise the contribution we may make to peace and the social justice intrinsic to peace. In the person of the God-man who walked among us as one of us, we see divinity and humanity combined. Thus, we cannot serve God without also serving our fellow man. Not only in his incarnation, but in his ministry to us, we see an example of how we should relate to a choice between conflict and peace. Now, there's some in the Seventh-day Adventist Church today who hate this word, social justice. They derisively talk about social justice warriors. They think of it as something that's foreign to who we are as Seventh-day Adventists and what our message is. But Neil Wilson, who is what we call a very conservative leader of the church, said social justice is intrinsic to peace, and we have a Christian obligation to support it and to work for peace. And why? Because it's rooted in our theology of in our Christology of who Jesus was, combining the divinity and humanity, serving God, but also having the obligation to serve humanity. So how do we put it all together and organize the church for a more strategic approach to peacemaking? That's one of the things discussed at the Kroc Institute. I went to a session on the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, which used this illustration, and I quickly saw Adventist parallels. They have a coordinator for the Catholic Peacebuilding Network, and they connect with the bishops' conferences, with universities and institutes, and with development agencies and Catholic associations to kind of keep everybody in the loop, to share information, to coordinate approach so that all see that they're part of the church's efforts to promote peacemaking. Here's how that approach could apply to us. We could create an Adventist peacebuilding network. It would include ADRA, GC and division ministries such as education, chaplaincy, youth ministry, community services, health ministries, our universities and our healthcare systems and associations like ASI and the Adventist Peace Fellowship. Elder Wilson highlighted two things: peace and justice. While I was at the Kroc Institute program, one of my friends that I met there from Claremont Graduate University, he gave a presentation in which he added a third element: thriving. Peace, justice, and thriving. I told him I'm taking that because I think that adds the Adventist emphasis. I have come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly. Peace is not just the absence of war. It's not just legal justice. It is social justice that reaches down to those who are poor and oppressed and lifts them up, as the Song of Mary, the Magnificat, says, as we see in especially the book of Deuteronomy and what we call the Deuteronomistic history and the prophets, that God's people delivered from slavery have an obligation to the weakest among them, the widow, the orphan, the foreigner who lives among them, to restore, to lift up, to reconcile, to do good for the whole community. A balanced, healthy, thriving life in a world of peace. That's our goal. I invite you to pray with me. In words that have been attributed to Francis of Assisi, they certainly illustrate themes that we find in him. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned. It is in dying that we are born again to eternal life. Amen.